That door. It was the back door of our house. There was nothing wrong with its lock, nor were its hinges worn out. But at night it would be pounded upon with such violence as if it were suffering the wrath of a vengeful creditor. The blows were so heavy, we thought the door would be ripped from its frame and collapse. Yet whenever we opened it, we would find no one. Telling this story today might seem easy, but back then, things were entirely different. In a Black Sea village shrouded in misty fogs, in those days when the electricity was cut early and the nights felt endless, these sounds were not things we could dismiss as simple child's play. We were children. We didn't fully understand what fear was, but fear knew us, and it had found us. When my grandmother recounted those moments years later, she would repeat a single sentence over and over. Your mother was never afraid, and that was the truly frightening part. It was the 1970s. Our house was a relatively new structure in the village, a 2+1, small and simple. However, its foundation wasn't made of concrete, but wood. It was clearly a makeshift structure, built in a hurry to last only a short while. The space beneath the house was raw earth. The space above was like a prayer, thin and barely there. My father was away, working in a distant land. My mother was a strong woman who spent her days working in the fields and orchards, quietly taking on every burden. But when night fell, things changed. Strange sounds would rise from the house. Creaks would come from the attic as if someone were up there, pacing slowly. Sometimes the clattering of plates and cutlery would echo from the kitchen, as if an invisible soul had set about preparing a meal. My mother ignored these sounds. "It's just the wind," she'd say, or "the house is new, it's still settling." Of course, at the time, we thought she truly believed those words, but as years passed, we realized my mother was aware of everything. But the biggest problem was the door, the back door. The restless vibration that began with sunset would take a physical form in the late hours of the night, until the silence was shattered by those knocks. The first thud, 1, immediately followed by another hard strike, 2, and then the third, 3. As if someone were standing outside, throwing their entire weight against the door in anger, fists demanding an explanation. My mother would rise at that sound. Patiently, she would light the lamp and head toward the door with heavy steps. We would watch from behind, paralyzed by fear. When she opened the door, there would be no one outside. No footprints on the ground, not even the sound of the wind. Just a darkness as silent as stone. A thick, dense darkness that felt as if it were staring at us. This cycle continued for weeks. Then one night, something changed. Those knocks were different now, faster, harder, and angrier, as if someone whose patience had run out was lunging at the door with all their might. At that point, the need arose to visit a deceased scholar, one of the wise teachers of the village whom everyone spoke of with great respect. The Hoja came to the house and listened to everything calmly. He remained silent for a while and then uttered only this sentence: "We must look into this matter deeply." But even he was helpless at times. Prayers were recited, talismans were whispered, days passed, but to no avail. The same sounds returned on the same nights. Finally, my mother had a dream. 2 young men. They were very young, but their faces spoke not of hunger, but of incompleteness. They were lying upon the earth, but they had no graves. They had no names nor stones at their heads. When morning came, my mother said, "There is someone beneath this house." But what truly made my skin crawl was that someone else had seen the same thing. And this person was someone known in the village as the Haunted Woman, considered a medium in those times. No one in the village would speak her name, as if saying it would bring a curse upon them. When she passed by houses, doors would be partially closed and children would be ushered inside. But if things went south, eventually everyone's path would lead to her. My mother had hesitated to go at first, because in Black Sea villages there was a strict rule. Everything is first asked of the Hoja, and whatever he says is followed. But the knocking on the door did not stop. On the contrary, it became more frequent after my mother's dream. The haunted woman was waiting for my mother at her door. Without saying a single word, she took her inside and sat her down. Just as my mother was preparing to speak, the woman suddenly said, "You have guests in your house, but they are not among the living." At those words, my mother's knees went weak. The dream she had told no one was pouring from the woman's lips. Lowering her eyes to the floor, the woman continued, "The pair, 2 young men, they are not hungry, but they are unfinished. They are on the earth, but they haven't been put where they belong." Then she described the 2 young men my mother had seen in her dream exactly, from their hair to their old clothes, down to every detail of the expression in their eyes. My mother couldn't hold back her tears. The woman spoke her final words with serenity. "They were here long before this house was built. The house was built over them. That is why they knock on the door." "But why the door? Why at night?" The woman lifted her head and answered, "Because their direction lies at the back of the house. They don't want the inside of the house. They want what belongs to them." Following these words, my mother hurried to the great scholar at the other end of the village. The Hoja listened to her for a long time, then pulled out an old yellowed book, the Yildizname, the Book of Stars. He looked at it for hours, made calculations, and maintained his silence. Finally, he looked up and said, "The 2 young men in your dream are real. They are here. They lost their lives during the war, and their graves were never made. Their souls are still searching for a place to find peace." Though she was trembling with fear, my mother couldn't help but ask, "But why us?" The Hoja took a deep breath and replied, "Because you were not afraid. Every time you opened the door, you did not reject them." In that moment, my mother understood. This wasn't a haunting, it was a reminder. The main issue hadn't been voiced yet. The Hoja added a short sentence without taking his eyes off the Yildizname. "If you do not put them in their place, one day the door will be knocked from the inside." And then, that night, for the first time, sounds rose not just from the door, but from the walls. The Hoja's words echoed in my mother's mind for days. The door will be knocked from the inside. After that night, no one in the house could sleep peacefully. While we children tried to block out the fear by hiding under our quilts and holding our breath in our imaginative worlds, my mother would sit up until dawn, occasionally glancing at the back door. She waited in constant anxiety, as if something would emerge not from the door, but from the very earth itself. Early one morning, the decision was made. The house would be excavated. In the village, such matters were handled without delay. A few pickaxes, a few shovels, and the neighbors gathered. But curiosity wasn't written on anyone's face. Instead, there was a heavy sense of unease. The digging began at the back of the house, right in front of the door. At first, the soil was ordinary, damp, dark Black Sea earth. But a little later, the pickaxe hit something unexpectedly hard. They thought it might be a stone, but it didn't feel like a stone. It had an irregular structure. As the excavation went deeper, the color of the soil began to change. It took on a pale and distressed hue, as if it hadn't seen the sun in years. At that moment, a scent spread that disturbed everyone. Not quite rot, not quite carrion, but a heavy smell that seeped into one's soul. My mother immediately threw her pickaxe to the ground, her face turning white. "Stop," she said in a trembling voice. "There is something here." First, a tattered, worn-out piece of cloth emerged from the earth. This scrap, resembling an old military uniform, caused the silence to grow even heavier. No one spoke, only the sound of the light wind could be heard. As the excavation went deeper, two distinct areas came into view. Two spots lying side by side, but not in the shape of a proper grave. It was as if they had been buried in the mystery of the earth in a great hurry. The Hoja was called. He examined the earth carefully, then brought his hand to his face with a thoughtful expression. Finally breaking this silent moment, he said slowly, "They have been waiting here." The two young men from my mother's dream, the two dark silhouettes the haunted woman had mentioned, now, under the weight of the earth, they were making their presence known in the silence. But the strangest of all, throughout the excavation, the door never knocked. That night, contrary to custom, the house was draped in tranquility. But this silence wasn't peace, it was a profound anticipation. The Hoja warned, "You cannot leave it like this. You must make a decision." My mother asked hesitantly, "What decision?" The Hoja answered, turning his eyes back to the earth. "Will you take them from here and put them in their place, or will you give up this house?" In that moment, my mother realized the truth. This house no longer belongs only to us. While a deep silence reigned, suddenly a faint but bone-chilling sound was heard from the excavated earth, as if a body were struggling for life beneath the soil, gasping for breath. This indescribable sound put a stop to all talk. No one could voice what they heard, for some things are not spoken, they are only felt. The Haja, sharing the silence of the shocked crowd, knelt down. Placing his hands on the ground, he began to pray with complex emotions. The wind suddenly changed direction. In an instant, a deep coldness enveloped the back of the house. Breaking through this cold silence, the Haja said, "These were buried in haste. No names were written over them, not even a Fatiha was recited. They were forgotten." My mother fixed her eyes on the earth, which was full of unanswered questions. "What shall we do?" she asked with a trembling voice. The Haja replied without hesitation, "We will put them in their place." From that moment on, preparations began at the village cemetery. But one detail was different. Not two separate graves, but one dug side by side with no gap between them. The Haja offered an explanation. "They died together. If you separate them, the other will knock on the door again." The preparations were completed. Old but clean shrouds were found. No names were written. No stones were placed. There was only intention. That night, my mother had another dream. This time, the two young men were standing tall, and their faces were clear for the first time. They were no longer frightening. A sense of peace seemed to radiate from them. They were tired. One of them looked at my mother, and only these words fell from his mouth. "We thought we were too late." With the morning call to prayer, everyone set out toward the cemetery. Only a few people from the village were there. The absence of those who didn't come wasn't felt, because everyone knew the situation, yet no one spoke of it. The earth closed gently. As the Haja recited his prayers, he added one more sentence: "The soul falls silent when it finds its place." That day we returned home. For the first time in years, the house felt light. The walls seemed to breathe. However, when night fell, my mother still couldn't sleep. Exactly at midnight, a sound came from the back door, but this time there were no pounding knocks, only 3 soft taps. Tap, tap,
tap. My mother slowly sat up. She walked to the door with heavy steps and touched the handle. In that moment, an extremely clear whisper was heard from the other side of the door. "Thank you." My mother opened the door hesitantly. There was no one, but this time the earth was silent. A deep tranquility prevailed. That night, for the first time, my mother burst into tears. In the morning, we all noticed something new. The back door of the house no longer closed completely. My mother was the first to notice. No matter how hard you pushed, no matter how much you turned the lock, we saw that the door always remained slightly ajar, no matter how thin the gap. My father was away at the time, and my mother didn't feel the need to call a carpenter. She knew the reason. This wasn't a matter of simple wood. The door wasn't broken. It was open on purpose.
The elders in the village used to say, if the one who leaves is never to return, they leave the door ajar. Time passed. Days followed days. No more sounds or knocks came from the back door. Even the creaks in the ceiling ceased. The house, after a long time, truly became a livable place. But the traces left by the past were not erased. At night, 2 pairs of footprints would appear in front of the back door. These prints appeared much more clearly, especially after rain. But what was striking was that the footprints never crossed the threshold. They always stopped right there. Every morning, my mother swept the prints away from that threshold, but every time she wiped them, the footprints would return. One day, the haunted woman stopped by the house again. She looked at the door and nodded. "They are gone," she said softly, "but no one leaves without looking back." Then she turned to my mother intently and continued, "They no longer disturb you, but this house has now become their home too." Years passed, and eventually my father returned from abroad. When he noticed the back door, he stood there for a while but asked nothing. He only said, "This door must stay like this, because if some doors are locked, they will open again." One evening, my mother was rummaging through her old chest. She found an old piece of cloth. The scrap was identical to the fabric found during the excavation. When she carefully opened it, she found a small, rusted button inside, a soldier's button. At that moment, the pieces in my mother's mind came together. The village elders used to tell stories of 2 soldiers who had gone missing in this area during the war, but no one knew where they were buried. The things concerning that house felt as if the house had been waiting for someone even before us. That night, my mother had a dream for the first time in a long while. There were the 2 young men. This time, they were waving from a distance. Between them was the back door of the house. The door was wide open. When she woke up, my mother said in a quiet tone, "They won't come anymore." But then she added, "We won't stay in this house for long either." And indeed, not long after those words, we moved. We started a new life, but that old house we left behind, we didn't even look back as we said goodbye. As for the back door, no one moved it. It was always left in its place. Because in the Black Sea, you don't look at certain houses for too long. They say if you look, it will look back at you. We established a new order in a new home. Time flowed. Days turned into years. But the village is like a small holiday town. The stories do not move. The house from the old days was soon sold and found new owners. This time, those who came to stay were young and from the city,
so much so that they didn't take the old stories heard from the village elders seriously. After all, it's a wooden house, it creaks, they dismissed. For the first few months, everything seemed calm. But then, in the middle of the 3rd month, whispers in the village coffee house began to be heard. The back door stays open every night. A light is on inside at midnight. Footprints were found in front of the door. Of course, the new homeowners paid no heed to these words, even mocked them. But that only lasted until that night, until in the early hours of the morning, the sound of the back door being knocked from the inside was heard. This time, the sound wasn't angry, it was like a warning.
The next morning, the young man went to the elders of the village. He asked questions and received answers. Through this, for the first time, what we had experienced years ago reached his ears. As advised, that evening he placed a bowl of water and a piece of bread in front of the back door. After that night, the knocking sounds from the door never happened again, but that door still hadn't closed. Years passed, and one day someone from the village placed a small stone at the back of the house. There was no name or mark on it, only 2 scratches, side by side, silent. After that day, no one spoke loudly in front of that door. As for me, I grew up and went to the city, but whenever I spoke to someone from the village, the conversation would eventually turn to that house. The house with the open door, they would call it, never even mentioning its name. Years later, on a summer day, I returned to the village. When I passed by the house, the door was still there, slightly ajar. There was no wind blowing, no movement, yet the door swayed gently. I didn't go inside, because there are some houses you do not enter as a guest. And in that moment, I realized we had moved out of that house, but the story had not moved out of us. When I heard this story from my late grandmother, I understood it better. When she told it, she never said we were afraid, she only said we showed respect. My grandmother always used to say, a house isn't just 4 walls, it has a below and it has an above. As children, we couldn't decipher the meaning of this, of course, but now I understand. Those 2 young men, no one knew their names. They never had gravestones, but they had a place. And we, without realizing it, had built a house over them. In her final days, my grandmother had said, they weren't angry, they just thought they were forgotten. Because when a person is forgotten, they knock on the door. When they are remembered, they fall silent. In the village, everyone still looks at the back door when they pass by that house. No one thinks of closing it, because they know that if you close that door, it will be knocked upon again. Today, whenever I hear a groundless creak at night in any house, or when a door sways when there is no wind, my grandmother's voice comes to my mind. First, listen. The reason I tell this story is not to frighten, but to remind, for the elders did nothing in vain. Leaving the door ajar wasn't out of fear, it was out of grace. That house is still there, the back door is still ajar, and no one in the village goes inside through that door. But as they pass, there are those who bow their heads and give their greetings. Because some doors are not locked, some guests are not turned away, and some stories are never forgotten. In the Black Sea they still say, if the door is open, there is surely a reason.